Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited about because it's just a topic I love to revisit every single year. That's right, today I'm going to be chatting through some books I would sell my soul to have the opportunity to read for the first time again. Some of my all-time favorite reads, both in like the full execution, but also books I just have a fond memory of the reading experience itself, even if that reading experience like broke me into a million pieces. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book and series I have to mention is the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. Obviously, Brandon Sanderson is one of my all-time favorite writers out there. This is a series I've actually read and reread multiple times. There's something so giant and all-consuming about this series that the reading experience is just unmatched, at least for me. This is like a perfect example of what I love so much. And each book, in my opinion, also just draws me in different ways. I do think the second one is my favorite, but nevertheless, if I could just stop whatever I was doing at any point in time and reread the Stormlight Archive, I would. And honestly, I would love to have the opportunity to pick this up and read it for the first time again, because it was just so great. But if you're not familiar, the Stormlight Archives is Brandon Sanderson's like epic fantasy series. It's a huge world with a huge cast of characters, taking us on quite the journey. But in the first book, we're sort of introduced to a core group of primary characters, and each book kind of centers each character in a different volume and amount, but there's again so many people you're going to run into over the course of the series. First character we're introduced to is Kaladin, and he was once a medic but is now a slave brought to the war front that exists within this novel. Having basically given up hope on every aspect of his life, you see him sort of try to survive. We follow Shallan, who is a young girl who is very bright, but her family is in a very dire situation, so she agrees to basically become the apprentice of a very powerful individual in hopes of like tricking her and stealing from her to save her family. And lastly, I would say there's Dalinar, who is a leader of a particular like grouping of warriors within this world. And again, the cast of characters is huge. There's so many characters in and around these people. They interact with one another, and you will meet and fall in love with a lot more characters along the way. I would say the plot of the series is so large, it's kind of hard to describe. Just know it basically starts out on a plane of warfare. Basically, one civilization is very war-centric, and they've been at war with another group of individuals for many generations at this point, a war of revenge, but it sort of turned into like a war of sport and resource gathering. There's a lot of corruption at play here, but obviously this plot grows and grows, and it has a lot to do with the fate of civilization and the world as we know it, as you would expect from Brandon Sanderson. Honestly, just talking about this makes me want to reread it. It might be because it's like winter time and like this type of series is exactly what I could want, but it's so good. Speaking of excellent fantasy, the next series that I wish I could reread again for the first time is the City of Stairs series by Robert Jackson Bennett. I have said it before and I will say it again. This series is criminally underrated. This I would describe as like a fantasy series meets political thriller, and it has a lot to do with like international relations and espionage in terms of its plotting. This is set in a fantasy world where there was once this really powerful kingdom that used the power of the gods to basically subjugate and try to conquer the entire world. A neighboring country, which this kingdom tried to take over, fought back and successfully actually accomplished doing the impossible, which was killing off all of the gods, resulting in a phenomenon called the blink, which is basically exactly as it sounds, because in a blink of an eye, basically all of the infrastructure, anything powered by the gods within this once powerful kingdom disappeared spontaneously, resulting in this kingdom like crumbling before everyone's eyes. And now this kingdom that was once overruled is now ruling over Boooookssss. Fast forward to present day, we're introduced to our main character Shara, and she works again for this government, and her job is to basically go to various cities, root out any unrest, and especially try to make sure no conversations or connections to the gods ever comes up again. She enters a city at the beginning of this book because she hears rumors of the gods sort of returning, and it's up to her to figure out what's going on and prevent this from happening. This series is so unbelievably complex, from the politics to the emotions of what happens throughout the course of this series. Each book kind of centers a new main character, but they are very much connected and also take place over a very large swath of time. I feel like Robert Jackson Bennett really folds in the complex nature of like international relations, but sets it in a fantasy world and adds some fantasy components and questions that just really elevates the entire reading experience. I loved this series so much, and honestly, like blew my mind and captivated me. I had like no expectations going into this, which I feel like is so rare, and I feel like that element too just really made it such a blast, even though it destroyed me emotionally to read. The next book, or should I say author, I wish I could read for the first time again, has to be Emily St. John Mandel. Emily St. John Mandel was one of my very first like literary fiction leaning authors I ever picked up, and I just fell in love with her writing style and her stories, and I have since read every book she has put out since. Luckily for me, she's probably going to be writing more books, but to have the opportunity to read all of these books with fresh eyes again would just be a delight. There's something just about her plotting and all of her inputs that just work so well. She's just one of my favorite authors. I love her contemplations on humanity. I love the sort of interconnectedness of all of her novels together, existing within this sort of Emily St. John Mandel universe. I love her tapestry of points of views that seem disparate but come together in such a satisfying way at the end of her work. All of her books too feel very unique from one another, but still have like her signature style at play. Station 11 was her first book and the first book I ever read. This book is set both during and after a pandemic that hits the world, resulting in the end of the world as we know it. We follow again the immediate aftermath of this pandemic, but also a traveling theater group set 50 years in the future as they're traveling around and performing. It's so good and so emotional, and honestly carries all new weight now than even when it was released, in my opinion. We have The Glass Hotel, which centers around a hotel, literally, as well as a financial Ponzi scheme and characters who are in and around this sort of devastating financial crime. And lastly, and maybe my second favorite, which is A Sea of Tranquility, which is kind of a sci-fi leaning thriller story. Lots of contemplations on humanity, where we're going, lots of really meta characters within this too. It's a very compelling narrative, and it will just like pull you through time with this. I'm being very vague about this third and final novel because I feel like going into this knowing as little as possible is key, but let's just say it starts out in like the 1800s and you end up way far in the future on like the moon. So it's an awesome ride from beginning to end. I just love this author so much, and I just feel like she's been so formative in my reading taste too as a reader in general. And I would love to have the opportunity to read them again. Next up is a sci-fi book that just utterly blew my mind and stressed me out in every way, shape, and form. The entire duology is just top-notch, and that is A Memory Called Empire by Arcady Martin, the sequel being A Desolation Called Peace. This duology is just like so top-notch, both in its ideation and the world it creates. I mean, just trying to understand and unpack this sci-fi setting was one of the coolest reading experiences because it was so complex. The author created a whole new society, a whole new language, how it functions just felt so different, but in some ways reminiscent of how humanity or like living organisms could progress. But to take a step back, in this story, we're introduced and read from the perspective of our main character, Mahit, and Mahit is an ambassador, and she is from a very small space station. And at the beginning of this book, she's traveling to a very colonial and very powerful sort of empire to serve as an ambassador for her small space station to protect their interests. But Mahit also loves and is fascinated by this empire's culture, but she arrives there and everything is sort of turned upside down when she realizes that her predecessor is dead and she doesn't know if it's murder or not. Book 1 takes place over an incredibly short period of time, and you watch Mahit as she's thrown headfirst into like verbal politics that mean not just like her life, but also the life of her space station and this empire itself. You're not sure who to trust. You're navigating such complex scenarios. My mind was boggled constantly. And alongside all of that, learning and experiencing this culture through Mahit's eyes was just fascinating. So much of this book is about being an outsider despite how much you yearn to belong, how isolating cultures can be to different people, art and language being used as a weapon. It's just amazing. And book 2, in my opinion, is even better than book 1, escalates the whole plot intensity to a whole new level. This duology is just impeccable. And it makes me want to read more sci-fi like every day. Every time I think about it, I'm like, dang, that was so good. Next up, I have to give a shout out to A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos. There is something so magical and whimsical and dark about this series that I feel like I have been chasing ever since I read it. The inputs of this book are just like perfectly tailored to what I love in stories, and I was just truly so delighted by it, and I just wish I could find more books like this. So if you know books kind of like this, please let me know down below in the comments. My Winter's Promise is actually the first book to a YA fantasy quartet, and honestly, I really can say it's one of the strangest YA books I've ever read, and that is truly a compliment. But in this book, we're introduced to our main character, Ophelia, and in Ophelia's world, there are basically different spires floating in the sky that make up different kingdoms and civilizations. Each spire has their own government, set of powers, and god that resides over everyone living there. Ophelia lives on her spire with her family, and she is kind of very separate from them. She has her own abilities. One is her ability to walk through mirrors, but also the other is to be able to touch objects and see its entire history, which results in her running a museum. Ophelia is happy. She's happy in her isolation. She has no interest in getting married, and she's honestly not very close with her family. Her entire life, though, is turned upside down when her family, tired of her rejecting every marriage proposal, accepts a marriage proposal on her behalf at a very far away and dangerous spire. We then follow Ophelia as she travels there to this new, very desolate and very, very cold place. Here, I would say it has this shimmering court quality to it, kind of like Catherine the Great meets Versailles energy, if you know what I mean. The spire itself is freezing cold, and the magic has to do with illusions. The politics are very cutting and violent, and Ophelia is thrown headfirst into all of this, and her new fiance is not very helpful at all, to say the least. I just feel like the concept, this world and setting was so bizarre. I loved it. The politics were fascinating. The writing style is beautiful. It has this whimsy fairy tale element to it that just drew me in right away, and it has a darkness that I feel like works so well. And I also just love how unusual Ophelia is as a main character. I just love this series. I want to reread it personally because I haven't actually read the last book. I have this thing where I wait too long to finish series that I love so much because I don't want them to end, and then I forget everything. So while I can't read it for the first time again, I probably will be rereading it soon. The next book that's on my list is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. Honestly, if I could do it all over again, I would love to read this for the first time once this series is completed, because folks, book 1, fantastic. Book 2, one of my favorite books from this year, and I am agonizingly waiting for the final book in this trilogy, and I'm feeling very impatient about it. But wow, let's talk about a new fantasy series entering the field, and just one that absolutely delights me conceptually, writing style, the point of view character we read from, the angst that exists within this. Captivating, to say the least. This book is set in a fantasy world where there is an empire, and the emperor basically rules and maintains control through individuals called justices. Justices have magical abilities and can also act as the judge and executioner on behalf of the emperor's law. In this book, we're introduced to one of the most powerful justices, Sir Conrad Vunvold, but this book is not told from his point of view. It's told from the point of view of his female apprentice, who's sort of writing the story in reflection after many, many years in the future, which creates such an interesting dynamic, both in the humor and how the story sort of unfolds. But at the beginning of book 1, they're investigating a series of aristocratic corruption, but it sort of begins to bleed into a larger conspiracy impacting the entire empire. I really liked book 1, but the ballooning of the politics into book 2, fantastic, and the character dynamics in book 2, stunning. I loved book 2 so much. If you love sort of investigative but also bureaucratic, complex politics sort of situation with magic and combat, you've got to check this out. And again, the writing style and point of view character of this is just stunning. 10 out of 10. I love this series. I love it. Next book I wish I could read for the first time again has to be A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This book is like a warm hug and a story. I wish I could just read and forget this book over and over and over again, and anytime I'm feeling a little anxious, a little sad, I can just pull this off my shelf and read it again. Not that it doesn't have a delightful effect upon a reread, but there's just something about experiencing it for the first time that just works wonders, I tell you. But this story is set in a post-apocalyptic sci-fi setting, a society that after a war between robots and humans basically decided that capitalism isn't for them, and now we live in small, beautiful communities centering on love and belonging, and it's delightful. And in this book, we follow our main character Dex, who is a tea monk. They basically travel from city to city, offering advice and solace to anyone who comes to their shop. At the beginning of this book, though, Dex is feeling a little lost, a little unsure of where they want to go in their life, so they decide to go on a journey into the great wilderness. There, they run into an unexpected unexpected individual, a robot. They begin to travel together, they begin to learn and talk to one another, sharing stories and experiences and just like forming a bond. You would just not believe. The humor and heart that exists in this story is just stunning. The sequel is fantastic. Again, I just feel like this book is like a dash of warmth into my life and soul, and I wish I could just read it and erase it over and over again because it's so dang amazing. And the last book I wish I could read for the first time, again, is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a fantasy, historical, literary fiction tale, and it honestly is like the perfect blend of all of those genres. It has such a beautiful writing style, immersive and stunning, as you would expect with literary fiction. The historical setting absolutely shines in this with just the perfect mix and dash of fantasy to bring us through. Character study we get to experience within the story through a whole cast of characters with a lot of gray morals, a lot of different queer identities, and how all of those things intersect and are impacted by the time period they exist in. It's just so unbelievably good. Our main character that we're introduced to in book one is our main character Zhu, and they, at the beginning of the story, is the only daughter to a very poor peasant family, and after a series of tragic events, and Zhu decides to take on the mantle and identity of her older brother. From there, she basically enters a monastery to get education. She also gets involved in rebellion and quickly moves up their ranks. There's just so much happening in this. I'm reading the sequel this month. Somebody yell at me if I don't. But this book was just so good. One of my favorite books of the year. When I read it, it just like rocked my world. You know what I mean? You don't need to read a book that's just like, wow, that was good. That is how I feel about this. It was just really good, all right? You know what I mean? Alrighty, guys, those are some books I would sell my soul to read for the first time. Again, please let me know down below some books you love so much you wish you could forget about them so you could read them and enjoy them for the first time, as I would love to know. I'm always looking for book recs, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.